In Hollywood, being judged for being gay or shunned for living with HIV/AIDS isn't just a plot twist, it's a brutal reality. A reality that has shaped the lives of some of the most iconic Black actors, singers, and entertainers the world has ever known. These individuals didn't simply struggle to survive, they fought relentlessly for the right to be seen, heard, and accepted as their true selves. They faced rejection, silence, and the merciless prejudices of an industry where fame can arrive overnight and disappear just as fast, leaving scars behind. Today, we uncover 23 devastating life stories, 23 powerful testaments to resilience, bravery, and truth. Prepare yourself, because these stories may leave you in tears. Marsha P. Johnson. A name that embodies freedom, and a death shrouded in mystery beneath the dark waters of the Hudson River. Marsha P. Johnson became a defining symbol of the American gay rights movement of the 1960s, yet behind the dazzling defiance of the 1969 Stonewall Uprising lies a life marked by suffering, silence, and truths never fully revealed, about identity, illness, and survival in a world that refused to understand her. Born in New Jersey in a boy's body, Marsha felt from an early age an unshakable truth: she was meant to live as a woman. Her eyes once sparkled at the sight of her mother's dresses, small moments of innocence filled with hope. But that hope was swiftly crushed by the very people she loved most. Her family's rejection came cold and brutal. Her mother's words, "Homosexuality is lower than a dog," cut deep, carving fear and shame into Marsha's soul. Those words forced her to bury her identity beneath silence, learning early how dangerous it was to be herself. Yet Marsha's spirit refused to remain caged. In 1963, she left behind the place that called itself home and fled to New York City in search of truth and belonging. Beneath the sleepless lights and relentless chaos of the city, she found kinship among society's outcasts. For the first time, Marsha felt seen. She felt free to love, to exist, to breathe without apology. But freedom came at a devastating cost. Life on New York's unforgiving streets exposed her to poverty, violence, and eventually AIDS, the disease that defined a generation's fear and neglect. As her body weakened, her mind suffered too. Schizophrenia cast long shadows over her life, leaving scars no medicine could heal. Still, Marsha continued to fight, not just for herself, but for everyone pushed to the margins. Then, on the morning of July 6, 1992, just days after a Pride celebration, Marsha P. Johnson was found floating lifeless in the Hudson River. Authorities quickly ruled her death a suicide. But those who knew her best refused to accept that conclusion. Friends spoke of a deep wound on the back of her head, evidence of violence that could not be ignored. Was Marsha silenced by hatred? Was she another victim of a society unwilling to protect Black LGBTQ+ lives? Her death was more than a tragedy, it was an indictment, a reflection of a world that turned away from its most vulnerable. Yet Marsha P. Johnson did not vanish with the tide. Her legacy endures as a living flame of courage, resilience, and defiance. She dared to love, she dared to fight, and she gave a voice to those the world tried to erase. Alvin Ailey. Alvin Ailey, the legendary choreographer whose life ended in heartbreaking silence under the shadow of AIDS. His name still moves like a mournful melody, lingering in the hearts of those touched by his art. Ailey was far more than a master of movement. He was a visionary who transformed dance into a language of liberation, giving voice to African American history, pain, and resilience at a time when prejudice pressed in from all sides. In the suffocating climate of the 1980s, when the HIV/AIDS crisis fueled fear and stigma, especially toward the LGBTQ community, Ailey carried his brilliance with quiet courage. Behind his radiant smile, however, lived a profound loneliness. He struggled to live authentically in a world that demanded conformity, haunted by the fear that he never truly belonged. Though celebrated on stage, he felt rejected off it. Whispers about his sexuality followed him like shadows, leaving him trapped inside a body that felt both admired and condemned. No matter how loudly his art spoke, it could not shield him from society's judgment. Just hours after welcoming the new year in 1989, Ailey received devastating news from his doctor. He had tested positive for HIV. While others celebrated with hope, he suffered in silence, burying the truth deep within. He feared the disease less than the cruelty of public opinion. Afraid his family would be shamed, his legacy erased overnight. That fear became a slow, invisible poison, draining both his spirit and his strength. On a cold December day in 1989, as snow settled over the streets of Los Angeles, Alvin Ailey took his final breath after a prolonged fever caused by AIDS. Even in death, his love for his family endured. To spare his mother from stigma, he asked that the media be told he died from terminal blood dysplasia. His passing remains a painful reminder of a world that failed him, a man who did not die solely from illness, but from the silence, fear, and indifference that society imposed long before his final moment. Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde, the fearless feminist and LGBTQ+ icon who fought injustice until her very last breath. She was celebrated not only as a brilliant poet, but as a razor-sharp thinker who relentlessly challenged systems of oppression, from gender inequality to racial injustice, especially within and beyond the LGBTQ+ community. Through groundbreaking works like The Black Unicorn, Sister Outsider, and Zami, a new spelling of my name, Lorde explored identity, difference, and survival, boldly defining herself as a Black lesbian woman, a poet, and above all, a warrior for justice. Yet Audre Lorde's battles were not confined to the page or the podium. She waged an equally fierce, deeply personal war against breast cancer, a struggle that tested her body and spirit to their limits. In July 1978, her world shattered when she was diagnosed and forced to undergo a mastectomy to save her life. Instead of retreating into silence, Lorde chose radical honesty. She documented her pain, fear, rage, and resilience in her cancer journals, transforming suffering into testimony and vulnerability into power. She wrote about reclaiming one's body after illness and finding strength in truth, no matter how raw. For a time, it seemed she had defied fate. But in 1984, cancer returned with devastating force, spreading to her liver and draining her already fragile strength. On a cold afternoon, November 17, 1992, Audre Lorde passed away in the quiet warmth of her home, ending a 58-year life defined by courage, resistance, and unwavering conviction. Though her voice fell silent, her message never did. Audre Lorde left behind a blazing legacy, one that reminds us that silence is never the answer to injustice, and that brave voices, once raised, echo far beyond a lifetime. Prudence Nobantamobile. Prudence Nobantamobile, the heartbreaking final chapter of an LGBTQ+ icon. Her name burned like a fierce flame in an era suffocated by prejudice and fear. In 1992, when HIV was not only a terrifying illness but a near-certain death sentence, especially for gay individuals cast aside by society, Prudence, a fearless political activist, stepped forward and publicly revealed her HIV status. It was an act of radical courage that shattered silence and stigma alike. Her life, however, was anything but easy. Prudence fought on two relentless fronts, the virus slowly wearing down her body, and a society often unwilling to show compassion. For more than 2 decades, she faced HIV not with despair, but with the heart of a warrior, unyielding, outspoken, and defiant in the face of fear. Yet even the strongest fighters are not invincible. Years of struggle gradually weakened her immune system. On the morning of July 10, 2017, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the quiet air, Prudence took her final breath. She passed away from pneumonia-related complications caused by HIV at just 45 years old, bringing her long and courageous battle to an end. But death could never extinguish the fire she ignited. Prudence did not merely live with HIV, she lived to confront it, to expose it, and to tell its truth. Her life became that story, written not only in words, but in bold action, tireless advocacy, and a legacy that continues to live on in the hearts of all who believe in the power of truth, resistance, and courage. Fela Anikulapo Kuti. An endless melody of resistance, and a quiet, heartbreaking farewell. Fela Anikulapo Kuti was more than a musical genius. He was a revolutionary who turned sound into a weapon against corruption and oppression in Nigeria. As the creator of Afrobeat, he fused jazz, funk, and traditional African rhythms into a bold, defiant genre that pulsed with rebellion and an unrelenting hunger for freedom. Every horn blast and drumbeat carried a message. Resistance was not optional. But Fela's life was anything but peaceful. Raised amid political chaos, he was arrested more than 200 times, his commune repeatedly raided, and his spirit tested by relentless state violence. The deepest wound came when his beloved mother was killed after a brutal military attack, an event that scarred him forever. Yet his greatest battle was not with soldiers or dictators. It was with an invisible enemy, AIDS. In the 1990s, AIDS was not only deadly but wrapped in fear, denial, and crushing stigma. For the Black and queer community, that burden was even heavier, pushing Fela further into isolation as his health slowly declined. The once electric force who commanded stages with fearless energy faded into a fragile shadow of himself, his exhaustion etched deeply into his face. No prison cell, no beating, no ban had ever silenced him, but this disease did. On a somber, rain-soaked afternoon on August 2, 1997, Fela Anikulapo Kuti took his final breath, succumbing to tuberculosis complications linked to AIDS. His death left an immeasurable void in the hearts of millions around the world. Yet even in passing, his voice thundered on. Fela's death forced Nigerian society to confront a truth long buried, the devastating reality of HIV, AIDS, and the lethal cost of silence, denial, and stigma that had pushed countless innocent lives to the edge of despair. Joseph Beam. Joseph Beam was a gifted American writer whose voice was taken too soon, leaving behind an unfinished yet immortal work, Brother to Brother. An African-American writer, editor, and LGBTQ+ activist, Beam stood at the forefront of a movement determined to carve space for Black gay men in American literature and social consciousness. In the 1980s, an era poisoned by racism, suffocating homophobia, and the relentless devastation of the AIDS epidemic, Beam rose with quiet defiance, using words as both shield and weapon in the fight for dignity and visibility. But time was not on his side. As AIDS slowly ravaged his already fragile body, painful red lesions appeared, fevers lingered, and his strength faded day by day. Terrified of humiliation and judgment, Beam avoided public health clinics, choosing silence over cruelty, endurance over exposure. He carried his suffering alone, determined not to let shame eclipse his spirit. On a bitter, snow-covered night, December 27, 1988, tragedy struck. While immersed in Brother to Brother, a deeply personal collection drawn from his own life and community, Beam suddenly collapsed at his desk. His family assumed exhaustion. They never imagined it was goodbye. Just days shy of his 34th birthday, Joseph Beam passed away, leaving behind unfinished pages heavy with stories the world still needed to hear. His death came at the height of the AIDS crisis in the United States. Yet perhaps AIDS was not the true executioner. Prejudice, neglect, and the deafening silence of both the public and the government condemned countless lives to disappear without compassion or justice. Still, Beam's voice refused to die. His close friend and fellow activist, Essex Hemphill, completed the manuscript through tears and determination, ensuring its publication in 1991. Brother to Brother went on to become one of the most vital works in American LGBTQ+ literature, a raw, unflinching portrait of Black gay men surviving, loving, and resisting during the darkest years of the AIDS epidemic. Through his words, Joseph Beam declared something radical and enduring, that people like him mattered, that their stories deserved space, and that living openly, honestly, and with pride was an act of revolution. Bayard Rustin. The man history kept behind the curtain, and the tragedy born of silence. Bayard Rustin was one of the most brilliant yet overlooked architects of the American civil rights movement, quietly stitching together the strategy, discipline, and moral vision that powered the fight for freedom. As a trusted advisor to Martin Luther King Jr., Rustin was the strategic genius behind the 1963 March on Washington, the very moment when "I Have a Dream" thundered across the nation and reshaped America's conscience. Yet while others stood in the spotlight, Rustin was deliberately pushed into the shadows, dismissed not for his intellect or courage, but for one reason society deemed unforgivable: he was a gay man. In January 1953, his life changed forever. Rustin was arrested in California and sentenced to 50 days in jail for lewd conduct after being caught engaging in consensual sex with two men. That single incident became a permanent stain, weaponized by critics and used to undermine his credibility for the rest of his life. In public, he shielded himself behind wide-brimmed hats and high-collared coats, not out of vanity, but fear of recognition, exposure, and ruin. Decades later, in 1964, the cruelty deepened when Rustin learned he was HIV positive, the result of unsafe sexual practices at a time when knowledge and compassion were scarce. Though he tried to keep his illness private, the truth leaked, igniting fresh waves of judgment and condemnation. For Rustin, the pain of disease was eclipsed by the anguish of rejection, from society at large and from the very movements he had sacrificed everything to build. When he died in 1987 from complications related to AIDS, his passing barely made headlines. His name quietly slipped from public memory, another casualty of stigma. Bayard Rustin became one of the earliest influential figures lost to AIDS, a death caused not only by a virus, but by the chilling indifference of prejudice. And yet, even as his health failed, Rustin continued to speak out for LGBTQ+ rights, fully aware that history might forget him. He pressed on anyway, because he understood a truth few dared to confront: silence, more than hatred, is the greatest enemy of justice. Rudy Lewis. Rudy Lewis, the golden voice and the haunting mystery behind A Life Cut Short. He was hailed as one of the most unforgettable voices of the Drifters, immortalized through timeless classics like On Broadway and Up on the Roof. With silky phrasing and raw emotional power, Rudy's vocals didn't just entertain, they felt, etching themselves deep into the soul of R&B history. But beyond the spotlight and applause, his life played a far darker melody. Rudy died at just 27, leaving behind a legacy of brilliance and a trail of unanswered questions. Behind his extraordinary talent lay crushing, invisible pressures. As a black gay man in an era steeped in fear, silence, and prejudice, Rudy lived torn between who he was and who the world demanded he be. Music became his sanctuary, the only place where his truth could breathe freely. Yet the life he dreamed of remained painfully out of reach. The weight of stigma and secrecy pulled him into a dangerous spiral. Nights of excess, alcohol, and drugs became his escape from a reality that refused to accept him. But that escape came with a silent destroyer, slowly weakening his body: AIDS. Tragedy struck on the night of May 20, 1964, just hours before the Drifters were set to record Under the Boardwalk. Racked by intense abdominal pain linked to AIDS-related complications, Rudy collapsed in a Harlem hotel room. Within 30 minutes, he was gone. His death was officially ruled a drug overdose, though his family believed immune failure and a sudden heart attack sealed his fate. No matter the cause, one truth is undeniable: Rudy Lewis was a once-in-a-generation talent the world lost far too soon. He was more than a singer. He became a quiet symbol for those who dared to live authentically, even when the cost was isolation, silence, and a tragic, lonely end. Gladys Bentley. Gladys Bentley, the defiant legend and the haunting mystery behind her final chapter. She was far more than a gifted jazz pianist. She was a fearless LGBTQ+ trailblazer who lit up the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s. But beyond the dazzling lights of packed nightclubs and roaring applause lay a life marked by secrecy, pain, and an ending still wrapped in controversy. Bentley was a black lesbian woman living in an era that refused to make space for her truth. Beneath the bold red lipstick, tuxedos, and thunderous piano riffs was a soul bruised by relentless prejudice and isolation. She loved women when love like hers was condemned, wore men's clothing when it was forbidden, and sang openly about desires most people only whispered about in shame. And for those who dare to live loudly and honestly, peace is rarely promised. In her later years, rumors of secret relationships and dangerous encounters followed her, along with a mysterious illness no doctor could explain. Painful red sores spread across her body, her throat burned, and a relentless cough drained her strength. On a cold, rain-soaked morning in January 1960, Gladys Bentley died at just 52 after a brutal battle with pneumonia. The official cause sounded simple, but the truth felt anything but. Some accounts suggest her immune system had collapsed, her body marked by strange lesions that modern medicine would later associate with AIDS, a disease not yet named or understood. That uncertainty echoed her life itself, questions no one dared to ask, suffering no one dared to acknowledge. Gladys Bentley lived like a jazz solo, wild, defiant, unapologetic, and cut short far too soon, leaving behind an echo that still resonates with those brave enough to truly listen. Barbara Jordan. Barbara Jordan, the iron voice, and the mystery that lingered beyond the edge of her life. She stands as a towering figure in American political history, not only as the first black woman elected to the U.S. Congress from Texas, but as a fearless moral force whose words cut through the turbulence of her time with rare clarity and power. Yet behind that unshakable public presence lived a woman who guarded her private world with unwavering resolve. Jordan was famously discreet about her personal life. She never publicly addressed her sexual orientation, despite being frequently seen in close, intimate companionship with psychologist Nancy Earle on the streets of Texas, encounters that fueled years of speculation and quiet whispers. The scrutiny took its toll, pushing Jordan into deep anxiety. Still, she refused to explain, deny, or perform for public approval. Instead, she chose silence, turning away from interviews and devoting herself entirely to protecting her political legacy in a society not yet prepared to accept such truths. That silence extended beyond matters of identity and into the painful reality of her declining health. In her final years, AIDS entered Jordan's life like an uninvited shadow. Devastated by her HIV-positive diagnosis, she reportedly worked tirelessly to keep it concealed. On a bitterly cold night, January 17, 1996, she struggled to breathe as crushing chest pains overtook her. Barbara Jordan died at just 59 years old, officially from complications of pneumonia, on an old, worn bed, and ending as quiet as it was heartbreaking for such a formidable leader. Yet many sources suggest her true cause of death was AIDS, a truth hidden behind layers of stigma and enforced silence. Her passing, surrounded by unanswered questions, forces a reckoning with prejudice, invisibility, and the heavy cost of maintaining a flawless public image in an unforgiving era. Dee Dee Sharp. Dee Dee Sharp was a relentless flame in the fight for LGBTQ+ rights, a woman whose life embodied courage, resistance, and unbreakable resilience. More than a transgender activist, she became a living symbol of what it means to stand tall in a world hostile to authenticity. Raised in an environment that punished difference, Dee Dee refused to let fear erase her identity. Instead, she transformed pain into purpose, founding Legender Incorporated, an organization devoted to uplifting transgender women, especially those living with HIV/AIDS. Yet even as she became a guiding light for others navigating stigma and violence, Dee Dee faced her own brutal battle behind the scenes. 25 years living with AIDS took a devastating toll on her body. Painful mouth sores and swollen lymph nodes made even the simplest movements exhausting, leaving her feeling trapped within herself. Still, the physical suffering paled in comparison to the cruelty she endured from society and the media. Being black, transgender, and HIV-positive meant carrying layers of stigma that few could truly comprehend. But Dee Dee never allowed prejudice to define her story. In a raw and emotional 2009 interview with PS magazine, she declared, "I'm tired of being disregarded. I'm tired of people spitting on the sidewalk when they see me. I'm tired of people not acknowledging that I am human." Rather than retreat, she confronted AIDS head-on, openly sharing her treatment journey to empower others. Her bravery made history when she became the first African-American transgender woman honored by President Barack Obama as a champion of change during the 30th anniversary of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, cementing her legacy as a voice that refused to be silenced. Assata Saint. A saint by name, a rebel by nature, and a poet whose life ended far too soon. Assata Saint was more than a poet, musician, or social activist. He was the unfiltered voice of a generation brave enough to love openly, live defiantly, and confront the truth head-on. At a time when HIV/AIDS was devastating entire communities and fear silenced countless voices, Saint refused to disappear into the shadows. He publicly disclosed his HIV status, turning personal suffering into a powerful act of resistance. Through searing poetry and uncompromising music, he challenged stigma, demanded visibility, and forced the world to look directly at what it wanted to ignore. Yet even the fiercest spirit could not outrun the devastation of AIDS. In June 1994, beneath the relentless summer heat of New York City, Asato Saint shared a final goodbye with his partner, Jan Holmgren. He passed away at just 36 years old, from intestinal complications linked to HIV/AIDS. Aware that time was slipping away, Saint chose creation over fear. His final works burned with urgency and truth. His poetry was never just ink on paper. It cut straight to the soul, preserving the voices of real people, their struggles, their dreams, and the loves they never had time to finish. Lorraine Hansberry. Lorraine Hansberry. The spark that ignited dreams the world wasn't yet ready to wake up to. A literary prodigy, Hansberry carved her name into American history with A Raisin in the Sun, a groundbreaking work that didn't merely tell a story, it exposed the raw ache, resilience, and quiet fury of Black families navigating life under brutal segregation. Her words carried truth like a weapon, demanding America look at itself without flinching. Yet beyond the applause and acclaim lived a woman far more complex than her public image allowed. Lorraine was a quiet revolutionary, an enigmatic soul who stood in solidarity with the LGBTQ+ community at a time when even whispers of such identities were dangerous. In shadows and silence, through stolen glances and secret affections with women, she lived a love the world refused to acknowledge. That private struggle, between the brilliance she showed the world and the self she was forced to hide, pulsed beneath her work, giving it its enduring emotional force. Before she could fully step into that truth, tragedy struck. Hansberry was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, a brutal illness that some believe was worsened by underlying health complications in an era of medical ignorance and stigma. Her life was cut short on a quiet January afternoon in 1965. She was only 34. After her death, history softened her edges. Her queerness, her intimate relationships, her full humanity were largely erased, as if parts of her story were buried alongside her fragile body. What remains are fragments, waiting for future generations to reclaim and understand. Lorraine Hansberry lived like a flame, brief, fierce, and impossible to extinguish from memory. Octavia Butler. A voyager between parallel worlds whose legacy refuses to fade. More than a brilliant science fiction writer, Butler was a fearless rule-breaker who shattered boundaries of race, gender, and imagination, reshaping the genre from the inside out. Yet behind the accolades and visionary prose was a quiet, private life that ended with heartbreaking suddenness. On the morning of February 24, 2006, while walking near her modest Seattle home, Butler slipped and struck her head on a cobblestone path. What appeared to be a simple fall became the first moment of a devastating chain of events. She soon suffered a fatal stroke and passed away at just 58, leaving the literary world stunned and grieving. For a woman who wrote so powerfully about survival, resilience, and adaptation against impossible odds, her abrupt death felt like a cruel and haunting paradox of fate. Bobby DeBarge. The haunting falsetto of R&B, a voice that soared through brilliance and sorrow alike. Born into a household where music was the pulse of everyday life, Bobby DeBarge grew up surrounded by harmony. Alongside his siblings, he spent endless hours blending voices, shaping a smooth, soulful sound that would later leave a lasting mark on R&B history. Bobby's voice was nothing short of extraordinary. His falsetto floated effortlessly, reaching celestial heights that mesmerized listeners and set him apart from his peers. Yet behind the applause and admiration, his life was far from flawless. Beneath the spotlight, Bobby fought relentless personal demons, most notably a devastating battle with addiction. As his struggles deepened, his life took a tragic turn when he was diagnosed with AIDS, an illness burdened by fear, stigma, and silence during that era. Choosing privacy over publicity, Bobby withdrew from the world, quietly carrying the weight of his illness. Even as his health declined, his love for music never faded. He continued creating, clinging to hope and the healing power of song. By 1995, his condition had severely worsened, and he spent his final days in a nursing home in Grand Rapids, Michigan. On the morning of August 16, 1995, Bobby DeBarge passed away from complications related to AIDS at just 39 years old. His voice may have fallen silent, but its echo still lingers, leaving an irreplaceable void in the soul of R&B. Essex Hemphill. Essex Hemphill was more than an acclaimed poet and writer. He was a fearless voice of resistance and an unyielding conscience. A relentless warrior against the brutal discrimination faced by Black gay men and people living with HIV/AIDS, Hemphill confronted subjects many were afraid to name: sexuality, mortality, rage, and survival. Though he spoke boldly about death, he could not outrun his own greatest adversary, HIV/AIDS. His life became a testament to both suffering and defiance, as he fought not only a devastating illness but also the crushing weight of social prejudice. When Hemphill learned he was HIV positive, he refused silence. Instead, he forged his pain into a powerful weapon, channeling it through searing poetry and prose that laid bare the injustices endured by Black gay men. As the years passed, AIDS-related complications slowly weakened his body. In November 1995, Hemphill died at just 38 years old. He did not merely fall to a disease, but to a society whose neglect and stigma stole countless lives. And yet, his voice still echoes, unbroken and unapologetic. Toshi Raygon. Toshi Raygon. When melody becomes a final testament. Toshi Raygon was more than a gifted musician. She was a fearless LGBTQ+ activist who turned music into a powerful weapon for justice, equality, and HIV/AIDS awareness. Her songs weren't just beautiful melodies. They were bold acts of resistance, rallying cries for voices pushed to the margins. Yet even her unbreakable spirit faced limits her body could not overcome. In 2022, Toshi passed away at the age of 58 after complications related to HIV/AIDS, bringing an extraordinary life of courage and advocacy to a close. Her passing marked not only the loss of a remarkable artist, but a sobering reminder that the fight for dignity, healthcare, and equality for vulnerable communities is far from over. Tim West. Tim West. A voice of poetry, rhythm, and fearless truth in a world that often demanded silence. He was more than a celebrated poet and rapper. He was a bold LGBTQ+ activist who lived his life out loud. Through powerful works like Red Dirt Revival, his poetic memoir, In 6 Breaths, and Flirting, Tim laid bare the raw, unfiltered journey of self-discovery, pain, desire, and resilience. What truly set him apart wasn't just his artistry, but his unwavering courage in openly living with HIV. Rather than allowing the diagnosis to define him, he redefined what living meant. He turned vulnerability into strength, using his voice to educate, uplift, and challenge stigma wherever it hid. Tim chose truth over fear, visibility over silence, authenticity over shame. Yet the deepest heartbreak came from realizing that even as medical advances transformed HIV/AIDS treatment, stigma still lingered, quietly embedded in society's glances, whispers, and uncomfortable silences. Max Robinson. Max Robinson was more than a journalist. He was a barrier breaker who reshaped American television. As the first Black anchor on a major U.S. network, he shattered decades of racial exclusion when he joined ABC's World News Tonight in 1978. In an industry that often resisted change, Robinson didn't just read the news, he challenged it. His career became a relentless pursuit of social justice, racial equality, and fair representation, driven by the belief that every voice deserved a place in the national conversation. In the mid-1980s, tragedy struck when Robinson was diagnosed with AIDS, at a time when fear, misinformation, and stigma surrounded the disease. Refusing to remain silent, he became one of the first public figures to openly disclose his diagnosis, bravely confronting public prejudice and humanizing an illness many were afraid to acknowledge. As complications mounted, relentless coughing, burning fevers, and painful mouth sores, his health steadily declined. On December 20, 1988, Max Robinson passed away at just 49 years old. Yet his voice did not fade. His legacy endures as a powerful symbol of courage, truth, and the enduring impact of using one's platform to demand change and break barriers for generations to come. Sylvester, the king of disco, and his final song. Sylvester James Jr., forever crowned the king of disco, was celebrated for his soaring falsetto and electrifying, fearless stage presence. More than a music icon, he was a cultural revolutionary, boldly standing at the forefront of LGBTQ+ visibility during the 1970s and 1980s. When You Make Me Feel, Mighty Real, exploded onto the charts in 1978, it became more than a hit. It transformed into a liberation anthem for an entire community, echoing joy, pride, and unapologetic self-expression. Yet even the brightest spotlight could not hold back the darkness of the AIDS epidemic. As the HIV/AIDS crisis devastated the 1980s, the LGBTQ+ community was met with fear, stigma, and brutal discrimination. Sylvester, the man who sang of freedom and limitless love, found himself caught in that unforgiving storm. After enduring a prolonged, unexplained fever, he received the devastating diagnosis, HIV positive, a verdict that, at the time, felt like a death sentence. But Sylvester refused to be silenced. Instead of retreating into fear, he chose courage. He went public with his illness, turning personal suffering into a powerful act of resistance and compassion. Through his music and his voice, he called for empathy, dignity, and solidarity for those fighting the same invisible battle. On a cold December morning in 1988, after 8 relentless years of struggle, Sylvester passed away from AIDS-related complications at just 41 years old, his body worn but his spirit unbroken. His loss left a silence that felt impossible to fill. And yet he never truly left us. Today, You Make Me Feel, Mighty Real, still pulses through Pride celebrations around the world, a living reminder that Sylvester's legacy endures. The king of disco did not fade away. His voice still resonates wherever freedom is celebrated, and it always will. Willie Ninja, the godfather of voguing, a legend forever etched beneath the ballroom lights. He was far more than a dancer or performer. He was a symbol of liberation, shattering boundaries of gender, race, and identity within LGBTQ+ culture. As the undisputed father of voguing, Willie turned movement into language, each pose a statement, each step an act of resistance, each performance a work of living art that transcended the ballroom floor. But even the most graceful motion cannot outrun time. On a sweltering June morning in New York in 2003, Willie Ninja collapsed after learning he was HIV positive. The tragedy deepened when he was forced to keep working to support his elderly mother, unable to afford proper medical care for himself. As the disease advanced, his world slowly darkened. His vision faded, his body weakened, paralysis crept in. After years of quiet suffering, on a cool September day in 2006, as golden leaves drifted past his window, Willie softly said goodbye to the children of his house. When the final leaf touched the ground, his painful journey came to an end, but his legacy rose, immortal. Gil Scott-Heron, a revolutionary voice of music and activism, whose light endured even through his battle with HIV/AIDS. Gil Scott-Heron was a singer, songwriter, poet, and truth-teller. His politically charged words, fused with jazz, soul, and spoken word, became a rallying cry for civil rights and social change. Yet behind the brilliance, his personal life unraveled under the weight of addiction, particularly heroin, which slowly eroded his health and career. When HIV entered his life in the early 2000s, it did more than steal his peace. It gnawed at unfinished dreams, fractured relationships, and pieces of his spirit. And yet, in the depths of that darkness, his art burned brighter than ever. I'm New Here, 2010, was not a greeting, but a quiet farewell, a whispered reminder that even as the body fades, the soul can still be reborn in every breath, every note. On a heavy summer afternoon, May 27, 2011, the heart that had endured pain, isolation, and relentless illness finally stopped. But Gil Scott-Heron never truly left. What remained was more than music. It was unfiltered truth, raw and unpolished, and a fragile hope that continued to glow long after the final spark dimmed. Ricky Wilson. Ricky Wilson was the last surviving member of the iconic new wave band the B-52s, and the creative force behind much of their unmistakable sound. As the band's lead guitarist, his sharp, unconventional riffs and electrifying stage presence helped define a genre-bending style that fused new wave, punk energy, and playful pop. But while the spotlight shined brightly on stage, Ricky was fighting a quiet and devastating battle behind the scenes. In 1984, Ricky was diagnosed with HIV/AIDS, a time when fear, misinformation, and stigma surrounded the disease. Choosing strength over sympathy, he kept his condition hidden from his bandmates, determined not to burden them or disrupt the music he loved. Tragically, on the night of October 12, 1985, shortly after a B-52's performance, Ricky collapsed backstage. Despite rapid emergency response, his life could not be saved. He passed away at just 32 years old, leaving behind unfinished songs, unrealized dreams, and a legacy cut painfully short. Ricky Wilson's death from AIDS-related complications was a devastating loss, not only for the B-52s, but for the entire music world. His story stands as a sobering reminder of the human cost of the HIV/AIDS epidemic and the fear and misunderstanding that surrounded it during that era. Behind every name is a remarkable individual, artists who changed the world not only through their talent, but through their quiet courage in the face of a devastating disease. Their stories remind us of the power of education, the urgency of awareness, and the irreplaceable value of compassion. What are your thoughts on these stories? Share them in the comments below. All information in this video is compiled from reliable sources and provided for reference only. Don't forget to like, share with friends, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss what's coming next.